So we have the supply curve, and very similar to demand, what we want to do is derive the market supply curve. So what we talked about was the supply curve for an individual seller. For, let's say, ExxonMobil, how much oil are they willing to supply at a particular price? So if I was to draw out ExxonMobil here, the quantity and the price. Here's ExxonMobil, their supply of gas. This is supply. Okay, so at a particular price, $60 per barrel, ExxonMobil is willing to sell us, we'll say 10 million barrels of oil. Okay, so that's one particular firm. That's their supply curve. It's the marginal cost curve for ExxonMobil. So I could draw another firm. Well, let's make them yellow for Shell. So we'll start Shell up here. Hopefully you can see that. My color choice maybe isn't the best here. Let me switch that. I wanted it to be so cool with Shell being yellow, but maybe you can't see it, so I'll trace over it here in red. So here is the supply curve for Shell. This is supply. All right, so at a price of $60, let's say they're willing to supply 4 million barrels of oil. So I can derive the market supply curve by adding up the individual supply curves at each price, right? So at $60, it's 14 million. Is my individual supply curve. So maybe I'll switch colors here to green for the market supply curve, right? So market supply is always going to be kind of an addition of everybody else. Okay, so I just add up the individual supplies at each price. That gives me market supply. Pretty straightforward. So you did an example in homework 3 of this. You have another example in homework 4 for suppliers. It's pretty straightforward. Now, there's one interesting part here that's worth discussing, which is, if you notice, I drew the individual supply curves differently, right? They all have a little bit different features. So if I redraw my graph here, that's actually pretty informative. So if this was ExxonMobil, ended up drawing Shell in red. Shell kind of looked like this. Well, it should be a little more upward sloping than that, but bear with me. I'm not a great artist, apparently. So what makes these two curves different, or why is comparing them interesting, is to remember that each curve tells me their marginal costs. And so different firms have different resources and therefore have different costs, right? So maybe, Shell is, relatively large firm, and for whatever reason, producing smaller quantities down here tends to be relatively more expensive. But once they get bigger, their costs don't increase by as much, right? Versus ExxonMobil, their marginal costs are increasing faster than Shell's. So one thing I want to kind of point out is what can I learn about this? Why am I diverting into all this stuff about why their cost curves are different? Is notice, right? So let's just make up, let's say this is 15 million, okay, barrels. For quantities of oil below 15 million, ExxonMobil can produce at a lower marginal cost than Shell. So at Q less than 15 million, ExxonMobil can produce at a lower marginal cost. At quantities above 15 million, Shell has a lower marginal cost. How do I know that? It's based on their supply curves. They tell me the marginal cost. Down here, the marginal cost for ExxonMobil is less than for Shell. Up here, it's a different relationship. Okay, so why all of this business is to show us what exactly does the supply curve tell me, and that can be very informative about the cost of producing for various firms. Okay, so we've gone through supply. It's upward sloping. Law of supply comes from marginal cost, is my willingness to accept. And we can take individual supply curves, simply add them up, and we get the market supply curve. Okay, so then what we're going to do, much like with demand, is figure out, okay, well, what's going to shift the supply curve to the left or to the right? And then we'll be able to put this all together and understand how the market changes when various events occur. How does price and quantities change? So for example, if there's a hurricane, that happens every year. There's hurricanes, especially in the southern part of the U.S. Texas, the Gulf Coast is one area that's hit. That's a major oil producing region. So when there's a hurricane, can we use demand and supply to predict what's going to happen to the price of oil and thus to the price of gasoline? And these will then eventually, we'll think about how that affects the macroeconomy. So we're moving. I know it's slow. We're building up all these parts, and it's kind of hard to see where we're going. But once we put these together, it'll be clear that we have a pretty powerful tool to analyze changes in the economy.